Hello and welcome back. My name is Dr. Katie Lynch, and I'm an English professor at Rockland Community College in the State University of New York system. This is my fourth lecture on John Milton's Paradise Lost. In the first lecture, I do a brief overview of Milton's life and the context of the poem Paradise Lost. And then I do a lecture on Book 1 and on Book 2, where we really dig in and analyze the text using the Dartmouth College's Milton Reading Room site created by Thomas Luxon and his students, of which I was one. So right now we're going to continue and do Book 3 of Paradise Lost. It's an especially appropriate book to do today, which happens to be Easter Sunday, April the 12th, 2020. In this book, as you'll see if you browse through the argument, which you should always do, it's a little abstract of the book itself. You'll see that the epic voice ascends with Satan toward heaven, and in fact this will be the first time that we actually get to see both God and the Son in their own space and speaking their own words. Previously we've only heard about those figures in the poem through the lens of Satan, and of course he is very biased against them. The book begins with a very, very famous passage, often called the Invocation to Light. Hail, holy light, offspring of heaven firstborn, or of the eternal co-eternal being, may I express thee unblamed, since God is light. Milton equates God with light, and I think it's really important here to note not only the biblical antecedents and references that he uses there, but also the fact that at the time he wrote the poem, Milton was blind. He was completely blind, and what would happen is lines would come to him. He would conjure up lines in his imagination, or by some accounts he would wake up inspired, and then he would call an amanuensis, or a scribe. That person could be one of his friends, could be one of his daughters, and so people who worked for him. So there were various scribes at various times, but he would dictate the poem to them. And in fact, there is some evidence, as I mentioned in previous lectures, that maybe as a result of this process, but I think regardless of the process, Milton did believe that the poem was divinely inspired, that essentially the Holy Spirit was inspiring him to write the poem. So he starts Book 3 with this invocation to light. It's especially poignant given the fact that he is blind. If you look at a number of ways that he describes light in these opening lines, it's really quite beautiful. He talks about light being before the heavens in this line, and this is a reference to the first chapter of Genesis, the third verse, where light is the first created thing, and I think that makes it very special to Milton. And he then says that the epic voice, the I of the poem, I am revisiting now with bolder wing, escaped the Stygian pool. So the epic voice seems relieved here to be back in the realm of light, when before he has been in hell, right, with Satan. The book starts in hell with Satan. And so the heavenly muse has taught the epic voice to make this journey down toward hell and then up to reascend. We heard Satan say in Book 2, long is the way and hard that out from hell leads up to light. The epic voice may share that sentiment in a way. It sounds like it's been a difficult journey, though hard and rare, right? The ascent is hard and rare. And then we get a really poignant moment where it seems like the poet himself is speaking. So he says, thee, light, I revisit safe and feel thy sovereign vital lamp, but thou revisits not these eyes that roll in vain to find thy piercing ray and find no dawn. And this is a direct reference again to the fact that he is blind. So even so, he says, I'm not going to cease to wander where the muses haunt. Milton, I think here, is putting himself in the long line of prophets who are blind, and poets who are blind. Homer, legend has it, was blind. That may be because in the Odyssey there is a blind bard or singer named Demodocus. It is probably just something that got attached to Homer if Homer was even one person, which he probably wasn't. But leaving Homer aside, there's also the story of Tiresias. Tiresias was struck blind after he was asked to adjudicate an argument between Zeus and Hera, or Jupiter and Juno, if you're using the story from the Metamorphoses written by Ovid. So there are a long line of figures, especially classical figures, who are blind, but they have a second sight, and they have a gift of poetry, kind of as a result, or or almost to make up for their blindness. And he lists some of them here. He lists Tiresias. He also lists Thamyris, Maimonides, Phineas, all kinds of poets that where it seems like Milton is seeing himself as in line with these poets. So he then goes on to say that, okay, even though I am blind, so much the rather thou celestial light shine inward, and the mind through all her powers irradiate. There plant eyes, all mist from thence purge and disperse, so that I may see and tell of things invisible to mortal sight. Here we have a direct sort of discussion of what the interchange, what the trade-off is. Okay, I don't have my physical sight, but what I'm asking, Holy Spirit, is that you plant eyes inside of me and banish the mist inside of me so that I can accurately see and tell the works of God, the things invisible to mortal sight. So this too is a nice little prayer, kind of like the one, similar to the one we saw at the end of the opening sequence in Book 1. And then the epic voice goes on to tell us that, we're going to talk about God now, the Almighty Father. So the Almighty Father is sitting above in heaven. He sees everything, his own works and all their works at once to view. And everything around him is good. Everything around him is his. He created it. And then next to him, on his right hand, the radiant image of his glory sat his only Son. So there's this idea in Christianity that the Son of God, the aspect of God that will incarnate and become man, that Son of God is at his right hand. And we talked last time about how important it is, the words sinister, left in Latin, the word dexter, right in Latin. Those words go on to have connotations. The left, sinister, becomes associated with evil and the devil. The right, dexter, becomes associated with everything good and right. And so that you're seeing that again here because the Son is sitting at the right hand of the Father. He is looking down at Adam and Eve in the happy garden. And currently, right now, they are reaping the immortal fruits of joy and love, uninterrupted joy, unrivaled love. If you look at really carefully at the prefix un and how it's repeated there, their joy will be interrupted. Their joy will be rivaled. So that's a very deliberate construction by Milton to say that right now we are still in the prelapsarian period, or rather the period before the fall. If you see the words or hear the words prelapsarian and postlapsarian, that lapse, that root word lapse, means the fall. So anything that happened before the fall is prelapsarian, after the fall, postlapsarian. They are still perfect. They are still obedient at this particular point. However, what you're about to see is that God, who knows all, he is omniscient, and he is omnipresent, and he is eternal, so he is outside of time. He already knows that they are going to sin. And this leads to something of a conundrum for many readers who wonder, how can he know that they will sin and not stop it? Or rather, also, I should say, how can he know they will sin and not cause them to sin? And Milton's going to do his best to explain through the epic voice how that's possible. God and the Son also see Satan. They also see Satan flying up. Remember, Satan has been flying up out of chaos, and he is now approaching the world, which hangs from heaven by a golden chain from the part of heaven that the rebel angels fell out of. And so God addresses the Son. Now, this is the best way to think of this is the Father, the aspect of God that is the Father, having a conversation with the aspect of himself that is the Son, right? It is one God, three persons, as it's often described in Christian doctrine. These are not separate entities really, but they are separate persons of the same God, or aspects of the same God. And he says to the Son, only begotten Son, look, right? Do you see what rage transports our adversary? The word Satan in Hebrew pretty much literally means adversary, so there's a nice translation going on there. And then God says, whom no bounds prescribe, no bars of hell, nor all the chains heaped on him there, nor yet the main abyss wide interrupts can hold. Now, this is true, right? Sin has unloosed the gates of hell for Satan, but God is in control. Milton's message, Milton's mission in the poem, to assert eternal providence and justify the ways of God to men, God is in control, and he is a benevolent God, and he's going to still take care of his creation, but he is allowing that creation to be free. And in allowing them to be tempted by Satan, that is, again, the measure of their obedience. Can they stand firm, knowing what is right and what is wrong, knowing that God has given them this commandment and told them to obey it, or will they fall? And so there's a sense in which Satan is still the agent of God here, even though he seems here like he's free, like he's burst out of hell by himself. Nothing is happening without God's knowledge. That's a really important, clarification that needs to make sure we know that here. He is bent on desperate revenge. God knows that. He also knows that the revenge will redound upon his own rebellious head, meaning, he's not going to get what he wants. He's going to have a revenge, but that revenge is going to come back to get him, kind of like karma. And then God goes on to say, he wings his way not far off heaven in the precincts of light directly toward the new created world, and man there placed with purpose to assay. So first of all, precincts of light is just one of those gorgeous Miltonic phrases that it's worth appreciating. And then this idea of assaying man, if you've ever done an essay, which you probably have done for school, that the root of the two words are the same. They're essentially the same word. It means to test. An essay is a test, and Satan is going to test man. And then God goes on to say he's going to see if by force he can destroy man, or worse, by some false guile pervert and shall pervert, for man will hearken to his glozing lies and easily transgress the sole command, sole pledge of his obedience. Okay? Now, the Milton Reading Room here glosses the word glozing as flattering, cajoling, perverting. That's fair. That's true. However, I also see another meaning at work here. To gloss something is to annotate it. To write a note in the margins, that means you're glossing. Okay, that's another word for it. And if you think about it, Satan is glossing the commandment of God. God has said something very simple. He said, don't eat the fruit. If you eat the fruit, you will die. Don't do it. I don't want you to do it. Satan will end up saying, as he does in the form of the talking snake in Genesis, that's not actually true, right? He's actually making a little note next to that command of God and saying, no, God isn't telling you the whole truth here. And so I think you see that word glozing as working on two different levels. So God knows that his creation will fall. He says, so will fall, right? They are going to fall. He, that's Adam, and his faithless progeny. Whose fault? Whose but his own? Ingrate, he had of me all he could have. I made him just and right, sufficient to have stood, though free to fall. Such I created all the ethereal powers and spirits, both them who stood and them who failed. Freely they stood who stood, and fell who fell. This is a really important moment because he is talking about free will. Okay, this is God explaining free will. Milton's God can be difficult to like, though. And so if you have been raised in a Judeo-Christian tradition, if you have been raised in an Islamic tradition, and you are sort of struggling with this notion of a God who is a little bit judgmental, stern, unlikable, you're worried about what that kind of portrayal does, I will mention a few things at various times of my analysis that may help you with this, but there are other readers who have believed or agreed that sometimes Milton's God isn't easy to like, and that's kind of an interesting observation that many scholars have written about, and you can look at the research on that. Regardless of whether you like him or not, what Milton's God says is that Adam is an ingrate, okay, and he's lumping Adam and Eve together here. But an ingrate, meaning he's not grateful, right? And neither is Satan. He had of me all he could have. I made him perfect. I made him just and right. The real key here, though, is that he is sufficient to have withstood temptation. That's what that phrase means. He is capable of withstanding temptation, but free to give into it if he wants. If God hadn't made him that way, right, how could they have given proof that they will be sincere and obedient? In other words, if there isn't a way for humanity to disobey God, how are they free? That's what Milton means by the sole pledge of their obedience, okay? This idea that without the commandment, there's no way to know that Adam and Eve are free. Otherwise, they wouldn't even be able to do anything wrong if there wasn't the possibility of them doing something wrong. Okay? And then he goes on to say, it's not just humans that I made that way, it's also all the ethereal powers. So angels and humans. I made them all free. I made them all able to withstand temptation, and all of them free to disobey me if they wanted to. Okay? And so then he says, how could I, if I had not made them free, if I hadn't given them a way to disobey me, what pleasure would I have gotten from that kind of obedience? When will and reason also is choice, useless and vain, of freedom both despoiled, made passive both, had served necessity. What he means by that is, if there was only one way for them to do things, the only option for them was to serve me, how could I have gotten any pleasure out of that kind of obedience where will and reason would have been serving necessity and not free? Okay, so Milton, through the epic voice, is really, through this dialogue between God and the Son, is really taking the opportunity here to hammer out his doctrine of free will. Okay, he also then says that Adam and Eve can't blame him. They cannot justly accuse their maker or their making or their fate, as if predestination overruled their will. They themselves decreed their own revolt, right? Not I. If I foreknew, foreknowledge had no influence on their fault, which had no less proof certain unforeknown. Here Milton is heading off at the pass the argument that if God knew they were going to sin, he caused them to sin. He's saying, no, my foreknowledge, my knowledge of it, didn't cause it to happen. Rather, they caused it because they are free. Okay? So therefore, they trespass, authors to themselves in all, both what they judge and what they choose. For so I formed them free, and free they must remain till they enthrall themselves. So he's again doubling down on this. I made them free. It's up to them to either stay obedient or to disobey. That's entirely their choice. And then he makes a really crucial distinction. The first sort, by their own suggestion, fell. The first sort are the angels, okay? Self-tempted, self-depraved. Now, I've always found this to be interesting because technically the only angel who was self-tempted was Satan. The others were persuaded by him, and you'll see that actually happening in Book 5. Nevertheless, Milton, for some reason, appears to sort of lump all the angels together, the fallen angels, saying that they tempted themselves, and as a result of that, they are the first sort. They're different from man. Man, by contrast, falls deceived by Satan, by the other, that's Satan and the angels, first. And therefore, man gets to find grace, whereas Satan doesn't get to have grace. Okay? So this idea that the devil is irredeemable, that he cannot find mercy or grace, that he cannot repent, that's being expressed here. Man is special because he was deceived by Satan, he was tricked by Satan, he gets mercy. And then God concludes by saying, in mercy and justice both, through heaven and earth, so shall my glory excel, but mercy first and last shall brightest shine. So the virtues of God that are being amplified here are mercy and justice, right? There's a balance here between mercy and justice. To fulfill heavenly justice, mankind has to be punished. But God is merciful, and that mercy is going to end up transpiring in the incarnation, right? The fact that that God will become man, and you're going to see that moment in just a few minutes. Okay, so you have then here the end of the dialogue, the end of this particular comment of the Father to the Son. There's ambrosial fragrance in heaven. You're getting a little bit of a sense of how beautiful heaven is. All the blessed spirits are surrounding them and praising them. And the Son replies. The Son says, O Father, gracious was that word which closed thy sovereign sentence that man should find grace. This makes sense. If you think about the Father and the Son, the Father is the aspect of God that cares a lot about justice, whereas the Son is the aspect of God who cares a lot about mercy. They are both God. They are not two separate gods in Christianity, but Milton is creating this dialogue to show you the tension between justice and mercy that I just explained. Then the Son says, look, it's great that you said that they will find grace, but, should man finally be lost? Should man, thy creature late so loved, thy youngest son, fall circumvented thus by fraud, right? He's getting tricked by Satan. That be from thee far, that far be from thee, Father, who art judge of all things made, and judgest only right. Or shall the adversary thus obtain his end, and frustrate thine? Shall he fulfill his malice, and thy goodness bring to naught, right? So he's saying, okay, Father, you said that you will be merciful, but how are you going to do it, right? How are you going to balance the judgment that rightfully you will be able to levy upon mankind for sinning against you, for disobeying, versus the mercy that you claim to want to do. Okay, and he asks questions that have actually been asked a little bit of Satan in hell. For example, he says, "Will you allow Satan to draw after him the whole race of mankind, or will you thyself abolish your creation?" If you see in Paradise Lost, book 2, line 370, this is one of the ideas that Beelzebub has, right? Maybe God will just abolish his own creation after they disobey him. That would surpass common revenge, is what Beelzebub says in that particular moment. Okay, and then God replies, you alone have spoken as my thoughts are, right? So in other words, just as Beelzebub and Satan were working together in hell to make sure that what happened, that the plan to attack God was the one that Satan had come up with. And I know I'm making a comparison that sounds a little dangerous, but similarly, in parallel, the Father and the Son are also kind of in cahoots right now, right? Because the Father has said, man will be an ingrate, man is not going to listen to me, man will fall, and he only has himself to blame. I will be merciful, though. And then the Son says, okay, but how? How are you going to be merciful when, man has essentially disobeyed you? How is that going to work? And this dialogue establishes the opportunity for God to ask his entire creation in heaven, all the gathered angels, who will help me by fulfilling justice to enable mercy. And I'll explain what that means in just a second. It's very apropos for Easter. So if we scroll down just a little bit here, God is going to explain a little bit about what will happen after Adam and Eve fall. He talks a little bit about giving them conscience, and if they listen to conscience, they will attain the kind of obedient disposition that they should have had in the first place. They will be permitted to essentially be saved. They will be saved. Those who do not listen to conscience, they will be the hard will be hardened, the blind will be blinded more, that they stumble on and deeper fall. Okay, but he says all of these people still qualify for my mercy. However, because mankind has disobeyed, right, they have to die. He with his whole posterity must die. Die he or justice must, unless for him some other able and as willing pay the rigid satisfaction death for death. So God is saying, as long as humanity listens to my umpire conscience, right, the conscience that they have in their mind, and they repent of their sins, they will be qualified to obtain my mercy. But they still have to die, and they will have to stay that way. They will have to be sort of imprisoned by death unless somebody pays the ransom. Okay, so there are a few different doctrines of salvation, or a few different formulations of the doctrine of Christian salvation that exist. One of them is this idea of ransom, the ransom theory, where fallen humans are held hostage by Satan and death, and God has to pay a ransom, basically through sacrificing the life of Jesus, right, the death of God as man. And that ransom, once it's paid, allows humanity to be free and to find salvation. That's one idea. And that idea is kind of in operation here, okay? And God says, say, heavenly powers, where shall we find such love? Which of you will be mortal to redeem man's mortal crime and the unjust to save? Dwells in all heaven charity so dear. Charity, in this case, love, right? Caritas, the idea of a sacrificial kind of love. And just like in hell, in book 2, when Satan says, who will go up to find this new world? Everybody is silent, right? In book 2, the devils were silent. Nobody wanted to volunteer. And here in book 3, the angels are silent. The heavenly choir stood mute. They don't want to volunteer to become mortal and to die. It's obviously going to be a painful experience. It's a sacrificial thing to do. And Milton makes this a very dramatic moment, because he says, and now without redemption, all mankind must have been lost, adjudged to death and hell by doom severe, had not the Son of God, in whom the fullness dwells of love divine, his dearest meditation thus renewed. So if the Son of God hadn't volunteered himself, Milton says, all of humanity would have been doomed to death and hell forever. So it's a very dramatic moment. Now, I want you to listen really closely to the way in which the Son accepts this burden and this charge to basically save mankind. So the Son says, "Man shall find grace, and shall grace not find means that finds her way, the speediest of thy winged messengers, to visit all thy creatures." And so he talks a little bit about the nature of grace, right? Grace is this winged messenger that can visit all creatures. And he says, "Behold me then, me for him," that's for mankind, "life for life I offer. On me let thine anger fall. Account me man." Okay? The word account is really deliberate here. It is a balancing of the books. Man is in debt because of their disobedience. In order to balance the books, God will become man, live a perfect life, sacrifice himself for the righting of that balance, and therefore fulfill justice and mercy simultaneously, right? Justice says mankind should die and stay in hell forever. Mercy says, well, but they deserve to be saved. The way that is possible is to account the Son of God man when he incarnates in the form of Jesus. Okay? Jesus will go on to live a perfect life according to Christian doctrine. He will then willingly die to save mankind because he is also God, not just man, but also God. He will then rise from the dead, and that is what Christians celebrate on today, on Easter. And when he rises from the dead, he will then essentially allow anybody who believes in him to have eternal life. That's what Christians believe. Okay, and what you're seeing here is the dramatized moment when this happens in the poem. So the Son goes on to say, "I for his sake will leave thy bosom," will leave you, Father, "and this glory next to thee freely put off," right? I'll become man instead of being here in glory in heaven. "I will die well pleased, and on me let death wreak all his rage. Under his gloomy power I shall not long lie vanquished, because," the Son says, "you, Father, have given me to possess life in myself forever. By thee I live, though now to death I yield and am his due. All that of me can die, yet that debt paid, thou wilt not leave me in the loathsome grave his prey." Okay, so the idea here is once the Son has paid the debt, okay, again, we have that language of accounting, then he will rise from the dead. So this moment is the heart of Christian doctrine. It's a really important moment. And what you are also seeing here is that it's well set up by Milton because we've already met death. When he says death, we're not just talking about the abstract. We know what death looks like. He's a shadowy figure, a menacing figure. He has the dart. He has the likeness of a kingly crown on his head. He's scary. And basically, the Son here is saying, I will accept the dart, right? I will accept the anger of death because it's the way to fulfill God's mercy. It's a way to fulfill your mercy, Father. And also you and I both know that, I will be able to rise again and conquer death, essentially. Death won't be able to hold me. So he says later, "I shall rise victorious and subdue my vanquisher." Okay? Death, his death's wound shall then receive. And then what's going to happen is that he's going to lead hell captive malgra hell. This is a tricky phrase, but it means in spite of hell, right? I'm going to conquer death. I'm going to, be essentially capture hell and bind the powers of darkness. And then I'm going to lead everybody out of hell who deserves to be in heaven. Okay. Incidentally, there used to be a gospel in the Bible all the way through the medieval period and even into the early modern period called the Gospel of Nicodemus, in which that was the story of Jesus after he had died, going down to the devil, defeating the devil in a battle, and then leading everybody who deserved to be in heaven up out of hell, including John the Baptist, Adam and Eve, etc. So Milton would have been familiar with that, even though I don't believe it was in the Bible, the Geneva Bible that he used. But again, Milton is super well read. He would have known that story, and it's sort of being alluded to here. Now, as soon as the Son makes his proclamation, it is praised by all of heaven. Okay. The Father praises him for making this sacrifice. He calls him, "O thou, my soul complacent, my soul pleasure, delight," and then praises the Son for the sacrifice that he's making. Confirms the Son's plan to be thyself man among men on earth, made flesh. Okay, then he alludes to the birth of Jesus. When time shall be of virgin seed by wondrous birth, be thou in Adam's room, the head of all mankind, thou Adam's son. So basically, he's taking the place of Adam. This is the replacement idea is another sort of way of conceptualizing Christian salvation. So Adam should have resisted Satan and didn't. Jesus will replace him, essentially, will fulfill what he should have done, will fulfill obedience. And the way that he remains obedient to God is by sacrificing himself to even out those scales. So Milton is alluding to a few different kinds of ways of understanding the Christian salvation, the doctrine of the salvation and the resurrection. If we move forward a little bit, you can see that the Father continues to confirm the Son's plan. He says, "So man as is most just shall die, as is most just shall satisfy for man, be judged and die, and dying rise, and rising with him raise his brethren, ransomed with his own dear life." There's that ransom theory again. "In this way, so heavenly hell shall outdo hellish hate." And the death of Jesus, the incarnated Son of God, will be a redemption. And so then he goes on to praise the Son, to continue to praise the Son, talking about his merit, making sure that the angels and also the readers understand that he will be both God and man. And then ultimately, the resurrected Jesus, the Son of God, will reign at the right hand of the Father once this mission to save humanity has been concluded. Okay, and then he confirms the fact that the Son is God, that the Son deserves every kind of praise and worship. All knees to thee shall bow. This is a direct reference to the book of Romans and the book of Philippians. All knees to thee shall bow, of them that abide in heaven or earth or under earth in hell. And that's almost exactly a quote from the Bible. And so confirming that the Son has all the same kinds of powers as the Father. Okay, and then this is a little bit of a sort of sneak preview of what will happen, relying on the book of Revelation. Ultimately what will happen is that the world will burn, and from her ashes will spring new heaven and earth, and that will be this sort of after the second coming of the Messiah in Christian doctrine. And so God is sort of laying out this eternal providence idea, right? He's establishing that he is going to have the back, take care of his humanity, and he's doing a high-level summary of how that will work, basically. Then he commands all his angels, "All ye gods adore him." He doesn't mean that the angels are gods. It's a way of talking to the angels. And he says, "Adore the Son and honor him as me." This is again establishing the equality of the Son and the Father. There are some people who believe that Milton subscribed to the Arian heresy of the Son being subordinate to the Father. There's a controversy about that. You can read the poem both ways, but in this particular case, there does seem to be an equality that's being expressed here. So then there's this beautiful song in heaven. I'm going to skip through this just because it's gorgeous to read. I mean, the description of what's going on in heaven and the song is beautiful, but it's not absolutely necessary for us to understand what's going on in Book 3. After we hear how beautiful heaven is and how the entire geography of heaven is sort of reflecting the brightness of God, we then hear the hymn itself. And the praise that the angels are offering to the Son for the mercy and that he is showing by appeasing the justice of God, by being incarnated and by dying. "Oh, unexampled love" is a beautiful expression of that phrase, this idea that there is no love greater than this. That's me slightly paraphrasing John 3:16, but the idea that this sacrificial love of the Son is the most powerful kind of love in the world, in the universe. And so they continue to praise God. They continue to praise, the Son. And now the epic voice is going to remind us that Satan is still on his way. So just as God and the Son, the Father and the Son together have been making this plan, Satan has been continuing on in his journey to approach the earth. So he has left chaos, or he's rather at the borders of chaos. Here he's being compared to a vulture. There's a nice little epic simile here, as when a vulture on Emmaus bred, etc. And then so on this windy sea of land, the fiend. Remember that when you're looking for epic similes, they start with as, and then they conclude with so. So he's being compared to a vulture here. He's walking up and down, bent on his prey. He's not yet on earth. Okay. In fact, where he is actually the purgatory, the limbo of the vanities, as it's described here. Now, this is a Roman Catholic idea, which Milton did not particularly believe in, but he's going to use the idea of purgatory to sort of get after some Roman Catholic beliefs. He is not a fan of Roman Catholicism, so I'm sorry if that is your belief. Milton, for many cultural reasons, just was not. He was highly opposed to Roman Catholicism. Remember that at his particular time, the Church of England is its own church. This is after Henry VIII has created the Church of England. Far after that. So, or rather, a while after that. I mean, not super far, but still, there are Roman Catholics in England, and they are tolerated for the most part, but Milton in particular does not like them. He thinks that they focus on things that are not important in all the pomp and circumstance of the Mass. Remember, Milton is more puritanical. He actually thinks that you can have a relationship with God one-on-one, and you don't need a priest, you don't need, a liturgy, you don't need statues and fancy altars and rose windows and things like that. You don't need those things in order to have a meaningful relationship with God, and that in fact, sometimes the opulence of the church can be corrupt. He believes that's the case for Anglicanism, and he also believes that's the case for Roman Catholicism as well. So when he's got Satan hovering on the edges of sort of the solar system, what's happening is that he has to pass through the limbo of the vanities, through purgatory. And the key word in purgatory is vain, okay? So purgatory is the place of all things transitory and vain. When sin with vanity had filled the works of men, both all things vain and all who in vain things built their fond hopes of glory, right? So anything that led to vanity, anything that people put their faith in aside from God, he's going to give you some examples. Various and sundry classical references here to multiple mythologies, also to some apocryphal biblical texts. This is kind of a little bit of a reference to a tantalizing line in Genesis, but also to the book of Enoch, where you have these giants, the sort of Nephilim story, if you've ever heard of that, the giants that come from the angels and the humans breeding together. These are the kinds of people who are in the limbo of the vanities. Empedocles, a classical reference. All friars are in the limbo of the vanities, by the way. So Milton, again, is sort of throwing under the bus all of the friars, the Carmelites, the Dominicans, and the Franciscans. He sort of rails against them for a little bit. He then, thinks about other people who are in the limbo of the vanities, or who will be in the limbo of the vanities. These are anybody who's selling relics, who's using rosaries, who's selling indulgences. Some of this might be familiar if you studied the Reformation at all. He puts no stock in any of these ideas, and so they all, to him, are are vain. They are worthless, and he puts them in the limbo of the vanities. They are mistaken, right, in the way that they deal with God's love and grace and forgiveness. They are not accurate ways of having a relationship with God, is kind of how he sees those things. You don't need an indulgence, in other words, to achieve forgiveness, is how Milton would probably explain it. So once Satan is kind of through the limbo of the vanities, he sees these stairs, okay, the stairs that lead up to heaven. The stairs were such as whereon Jacob saw angels ascending and descending, bands of guardians bright, when he from Esau fled. This is a direct story to reference, to the Jewish Bible, the Christian Old Testament, Genesis chapter 28, the idea of Jacob's ladder, and here you're having Milton make a reference to that. He then mentions the gate of heaven, okay, and continues to describe these stairs. Now, obviously, this is some place where Satan cannot go. He cannot actually attempt to go to heaven. He has been banished from heaven, but he sees the access point from earth to heaven, and he sees that they are connected to each other. So we're just going to skip down a little bit more. I want to get to the part where he is going to land on the sun. Okay, so after he's flying through the limbo of the vanities, he's seen the stairs and the chain connecting the earth to heaven. He is going to land on the sun, and he's going to be described by Milton as a sunspot. Okay, so there lands the fiend, a spot like which perhaps astronomer in the sun's lucent orb through his glazed optic tube yet never saw. Remember that the book began with an invocation to light. Now we're here in the sun, and the book is going to end in the sun. And so you have it opening with light and ending with light. The devil, when he lands on the sun, is like a sunspot. Now, Galileo discovered sunspots. He used his telescope to do it, as the note describes. By the time Milton met Galileo, he was blind, and I think there's a good reason for that. Unfortunately, they did not have the proper equipment for solar telescopes in the early modern period, and so undoubtedly Galileo, injured his eyes by looking at the sun through a telescope. But he saw sunspots. He discovered them. And this idea of the sun having an imperfection, and the imperfection being compared to the devil, is a particularly compelling description. So I just want to make sure we focus on that for a moment. Then Milton goes on to describe the sun. Remember, this book is indebted to light, and so he's going to describe it in beautiful ways. He's actually going to compare the sun to the breastplate of Aaron. And this is an Old Testament or Jewish Bible reference. Aaron had this ceremonial armor that had 12 gemstones, one for each tribe of Israel. And Milton's going to compare the sun, the brightness of the sun, to those stones and to that armor. He's going to use some words from alchemy. Here's an alembic. He's going to just have this beautiful ornate description, okay? And once he's described the majesty and glory of the sun, then we're going to meet the regent of the sun, whose name is Uriel. Okay, so Satan, remember, is here as a sunspot, like a sunspot on the sun. He then sees a glorious angel stand, the same whom John saw. This is John from the book of Revelation. He sees an angel in the sun. Uriel's back is turned to him, but even so, Uriel is majestic. He has a golden crown on. He has beautiful flowing locks. He has his 6 wings. And Satan knows that he can't appear in his true form to Uriel, right? Uriel knows who he is. So he decides to transform into a stripling cherub, so a young angel. Now, this means that Satan can change forms. This is really the first time that we see it. Maybe a little bit in book 1 where we see that he can change size, but in this case, he can actually change forms. And the first form he changes into is a young angel, and he is going to disguise his desire to see humanity. So he approaches Uriel, and Uriel is one of the 7 archangels who are closest to God, and he addresses Uriel. He speaks to him. He says, Uriel, here is what I would like to do. I want to visit this new creation round. I know that all his wondrous works, all God's wondrous works, but chiefly man, his chief delight and favor, him for whom all these his works so wondrous he ordained, hath brought me from the choirs of cherubim alone thus wandering. Okay? So saying, it's this desire to see humanity that has brought me to you. And then his language gets a little bit effusive. He says, I really want to find him, and with secret gaze or open admiration him behold, on whom the great Creator hath bestowed worlds, and on whom hath all these graces poured, that both in him and all things as in meat the universal Maker we may praise, who justly hath driven out his rebel foes to deepest hell. Okay, so Satan is kind of going a little bit above and beyond here in his language, in the effusiveness of his language, saying, I've heard so much about mankind. I want to see this incredible race of beings that God has made. And of course, like, we should praise him for having, driven out his rebel foes. He's laying it on pretty thick with Uriel. Now, the problem is that only God can discern hypocrisy. And that's what Milton tells us next. He says, so spake the false dissembler, unperceived, that is, unperceived by Uriel. For neither man nor angel can discern hypocrisy, the only evil that walks invisible except to God alone. It's a really interesting idea that only God can tell when something or someone is seeming to be something they are not. Uriel, for all his power as an archangel, cannot discern this. Okay? So Uriel doesn't see any problem with giving him directions to the Garden of Eden, even though he has the sharpest sight in all of heaven. So he says, your fair angel, he's addressing Satan here in the disguise of a cherub, your desire which tends to know the work of God, thereby to glorify the great workmaster, leads to no excess that reaches blame, but rather merits praise, the more it seems excess. So you've been talking a little bit excessively, but you're right. Mankind is amazing, and this new world is amazing, okay? So, wonderful indeed are all God's works, pleasant to know, worthiest to be, all had in remembrance, always with delight. So Uriel is saying, look, your idea to go down to see man is a good one, and I will help you. Okay. He offers a few other words here that we don't need to focus on. He then says, look, here's the moon. Okay. And what you're going to do is you're going to follow my finger. That spot to which I point is paradise, Adam's abode, these lofty shades his bower. Thy way thou canst not miss, me mine requires. So he points out exactly where to find Adam and then says, I need to get back to work. I need to get back to my duties. Okay? He has given him exact, precise Google Map style directions right to Eden. Okay? Without knowing that he's talking to the devil, without knowing that he's talking to Lucifer. So Satan then bows low as to superior spirits is wont in heaven, and you can only imagine how that galled Satan, right? Because Satan has said, I refuse to submit to God. But in this disguise, he is bowing low, and he takes his leave and starts to speed toward earth, okay? So the way that we leave Book 3 is with knowledge that God will redeem humanity when they fall, but also with the menacing threat of Satan about to essentially pounce on Adam and Eve. We'll pick up again soon with Book 4. Thank you, as always, for listening.